Hey, this is Brent Jensen. You're listening to No Sleep Till Sudbury, the show where we talk about the music that makes your skin vibrate. The show is brought to you by Storyfora, the content agency providing promotional videos, podcast production, and all kinds of digital content you can use to broadcast your brand to the world. Go to storyfora.com. That's P-H-O-R-A, storyfora.com for details. And should you be looking for a realtor, look no further than my pal, Mr. Steve Fleming. He's my personal realtor, and I would never, ever, ever use anyone else. Give him a call if you're in the market. You can find him at flemingproperties.com. Okay, so the other day, for whatever reason, I was thinking about the guitar players who auditioned to replace Ace Frehley after he left Kiss. Because some of those guitar players, after not getting the gig, went on to do some pretty cool things. And it got me thinking, what if some of them had gotten the gig? Mega hit songs like Wanted Dead or Alive or Sweet Child of Mine may have never been written. And rock history as we currently understand it would have been significantly different. It's interesting to think about. So let's go a little bit deeper into it and consider the scope of the whole thing. Listeners know how big an Ace Frehley fan I am, and so this chapter in History is one of particular importance to me. When Frehley began drifting away from Kiss in the late 70s, the band didn't just risk losing a guitarist, they risked losing a massive chunk of their identity. Frehley wasn't just the lead guitar player, in my opinion. He was the purest embodiment of the original Kiss mystique. His casual swagger and exciting solo work helped define the band's ethos just as much as the makeup, the blood, the fire, and all the rest of it for me. By 1980, Kiss had entered a period of existential uncertainty. They did disco flirtation with Dynasty, they made pop concessions with Unmasked, they released a mythical concept album with music from The Elder, and dwindling ticket sales had made it clear that something fundamental was about to change in Kiss. During this time, Ace Frehley was already half gone, I would say. Physically present, maybe, but mentally checked out. Ace Frehley's studio contributions in 1980's Unmasked were minimal, and even though he provided the band with 3 songs for the record, his overall creative input with other band members was more or less non-existent. Bob Kulick, a guitar player who had nearly joined Kiss in 1972, and brother of later Kiss guitarist Bruce Kulick, was quietly brought in to cover guitar solos. Kiss has such a bizarre history. Now, this was nothing new, of course, as Alice Cooper and Lou Reed guitarist Dick Wagner had been brought into the studio to cover for Frehley previously, as had guys like Rick Derringer and other guitar players. By the time music from The Elder was released the following year, Frehley's relationship with the band had deteriorated further. He appeared on the album covers and tour posters, but he recorded his parts and wrote songs from his home studio in Connecticut and had them shipped to the band. Kiss frontmen Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons were always students of the ever-evolving musical landscape, and they consistently had their thumbs on the pulse of what was popular in music, and they could see the new wave of British heavy metal coming. They talked about pursuing a more aggressive metal-leaning direction, and that was something that Frehley, who was rooted in 70s blues rock, had very little interest in being part of. By early 1982, the decision was inevitable, and Ace Frehley would leave Kiss, and Paul and Gene would begin searching for a guitarist who could save their careers. The Kiss lead guitarist search took place mostly in secrecy. There were auditions held in Los Angeles rehearsal rooms, in the form of late-night jams and studio test sessions. Some guitarists knew they were auditioning, and others thought they were just jamming with the guys in Kiss. But the lead guitar landscape was changing very quickly and drastically. The early 1980s were producing a brand new generation of guitarists who were faster, flashier, and technically fearless. You had guys like Randy Rhoads and Yngwie Malmsteen introducing neoclassical styles, and the new wave of British heavy metal was reshaping expectations. And then there was Eddie Van Halen, the one-man guitar monolith who permanently altered the vocabulary of rock guitar forever. If they were going to achieve relevancy, Paul and Gene knew that they needed somebody modern, and so they cast a very, very wide net. According to Yngwie Malmsteen, he got a phone call from Kiss when he was still in Sweden to talk about auditioning for the band. Apparently the call went poorly, and the process didn't go any further. One of the very first actual audition candidates of note was Robin Crosby, a towering blues-informed guitar player then associated with LA's Sunset Strip scene. Crosby's style was raw and aggressive. He was less theatrical than Ace, with a much heavier playing style. At the time of Crosby's audition, Rat was still kind of gestating at the Troubadour on Sunset, and they had just moved away from being known as Mickey Rat. Crosby playing had the grit that Kiss wanted, but his chemistry with the band never really ignited. No big deal, because within a year, Rat would explode onto MTV with their Out of the Cellar record, and Crosby, alongside Warren DeMartini, became one of the defining guitar voices of the 80s hair band Sunset Strip era. Had Robin Crosby gotten the Kiss gig, what would Rat have been like? What would Kiss have been like? Even though Warren DeMartini got more attention for his lead playing, Crosby was an imposing key figure in the band, in my opinion, and it's difficult to me to imagine them without him back in the day. But having said that, it's even harder to imagine him as a member of Kiss, really. Too tall, too blonde. And maybe that's why I didn't get the gig. I think the most consequential near miss of the Kiss guitarist auditions was Richie Sambora. In 1982, Sambora was a seasoned New Jersey guitarist grinding through session work and playing in a couple regional bands. He had the chops, he had the tone. He also had something else that he doesn't get nearly enough credit for: a fantastic singing voice. And this is something that Paul Stanley valued deeply. So according to Sambora, as told to Howard Stern years ago, Sambora gets a call from Kiss and flies down to LA from Jersey for 9 days. He walks into the audition with a bit of an attitude, not really knowing the material, and the vibe he gets is that the band was expecting worship, but Sambora wasn't that kind of guy. Paul and Gene assume he knows Black Diamond. He doesn't. Instead, he requests an informal jam, saying he's sure he can play their songs. So you can imagine how that went down with Gene and Paul. So things didn't really get off to the best start. Then it gets a bit weird. Sambora says he completed the audition, but wasn't interested in joining the band, saying he didn't like the musical direction the band was taking, and that he was more of a blues guy. This seems strange because you'd think that he would have been aware of their musical direction. Then again, maybe he wasn't. He hadn't learned the songs after all. It's really doubtful that Kiss would have asked somebody to join the band who didn't know the material and had approached the audition the way that Sambora did. Paul Stanley actually talks about this in his book Face the Music, and this is what he had to say about it. Richie Sambora flew in from New Jersey to audition. He wasn't the consummate guitar player he would become, and he didn't get the gig. It's funny, but years later, I heard him say that he hadn't really wanted the job because he wanted to be in something more blues-based. First of all, it's hard to imagine that he flew to California to audition for Kiss just because he liked airplane food. Also, Bon Jovi's done a lot of great things, but they don't sit next to Howlin' Wolf in my record collection. Ouch. Shortly after that audition, Sambora would join forces with John Bon Jovi, co-writing songs that would literally shape pop culture. 1986's Slippery When Wet sold 30 million copies worldwide, and 1988's New Jersey sold 19 million, and their entire catalog sold upwards of 140 million records. Had things been a little different, and Richie Sambora actually joined Kiss, many of the songs that powered the sales of those records would have never been written. Wanted Dead or Alive, Bad Medicine, Living on a Prayer, You Give Love a Bad Name, and It's My Life. Or maybe they would exist as some permutation of the original versions mixed with Paul's and or Gene's contributions. It's fascinating to think about because the outcomes are so radically different. For me, it's reminiscent of that 1998 movie Sliding Doors, where the difference between catching or missing a subway train completely alters somebody's life. Richie Sambora would have likely become a star in some capacity no matter what, but that sliding door moment of auditioning for Kiss, a seemingly innocuous and relatively meaningless moment for Sambora and Kiss, could have literally prevented Bon Jovi from becoming Bon Jovi. and changed the trajectory of so many lives everywhere. Another notable name from the Kiss auditions gives rise to the same consideration, that the lives of many would have been drastically altered, and that name is Slash of Guns N' Roses fame. However, it would seem by many accounts Slash was just considered for the role rather than formally auditioned. In 1982, Slash was only 17. He was a scrappy British-born guitar player living in Los Angeles, still trying to figure it all out. Paul Stanley also talks about his experience with Slash in his autobiography, saying this: "Another guy I spoke to was a really sweet young kid named Saul Hudson. He told me his mom had been a seamstress for David Bowie, and that his friends called him Slash. He was very well-spoken and engaging, but he seemed really young. Finally, I asked him how old he was. 'I'll be 17 next month,' he said. I had turned 30 earlier that year, and Gene was twice his age. 'You know,' I said, 'you sound like a great guy, but I think you're a little too young for this.' I wished him well, and always remembered him, because he was so nice and unaffected." So, not a formal audition with an invitation to join the band, but again, an oblique possibility. And had Saul Hudson joined Kiss and broken out that little riff he used to warm up his fingers that would later become mega hit Sweet Child of Mine, imagine the possibilities. What would it sound like as a Kiss song? There would be no Axl singing "Where Do We Go Now" in the breakdown, and no Slash in Guns N' Roses. All this seems mildly perverse, but it could have happened. There were other guitarists of note involved in the auditions for Ace Frehley's position in Kiss, but not really any others that would have dramatically rewritten rock history in the same way. Bruce Kulick, who would eventually serve as the band's lead guitarist from 1984 to 1996, after two other successful candidates, Vinnie Vincent and Mark St. John, came and went, also auditioned in 1982, didn't initially get the job. Steve Ferris of Mr. fame was apparently a top contender for the role, but was not chosen because he lacked confidence in his singing. Heart guitarist Robert Fisher was approached by the band, but decided not to audition after allegedly not getting a sufficient answer to his question about what the pay would be like. Future Whitesnake and Dio guitar player Doug Aldrich also officially auditioned for the band in an airplane hangar at the recommendation of Kiss drummer Eric Carr, but he didn't get the gig. And Bullet Boys frontman Mark Torian was brought into audition by producer and singer Greg Giuffria, but he was also unsuccessful. And then there was the Eddie Van Halen gossip. Two very different sides to this story. So Gene Simmons' side is that Eddie asked him if he could join the band in 1982 during a lunch, claiming that he could no longer deal with Van Halen singer David Lee Roth. Simmons said he refused to consider him, convincing Eddie that Kiss was not for him and that he needed to stay and lead his own band. When Ed was asked if this was true, he claimed to have no recollection of the discussion at all, and that if it did happen, he likely would have remembered it. He also said, "Maybe they asked me in passing, and I just kind of laughed it off probably." Simmons had a hand in recording Van Halen's demos for Warner Brothers back in the day before they were well known, but I can't really see Eddie leaving Van Halen in 1982 to join Kiss. It just wouldn't have made any sense. As we all know, Kiss ultimately went with guitarist Vinnie Vincent to replace Frehley, which turned out to be a pretty messy mistake. But back to Richie Sambora and Slash. It may be easy to say, knowing what we know about their playing styles and the songs that they would go on to write, that they would have never lasted in Kiss either. But knowing what we also know about how impressionable Kiss was in the 80s, and how they actually paid very close attention to everything Bon Jovi did after Slippery When Wet did so well, and knowing that Sambora and Slash were capable of leading bands, is it unreasonable to imagine either of these two guys joining the band and rising up to lead Kiss maybe in a new direction? Maybe not so much Slash, but Sambora? When I consider all the factors at play, the time being the 80s, the material they were putting out, and here I'm thinking more about Kiss's output during that time, especially a ballad like Forever, and the fact that Kiss were a bit vulnerable and desperately wanted to stay relevant in the 80s, I feel like it could have been a remote possibility. I'm glad it didn't happen. But what if it had? It could have. Fun stuff to think about. All right, this has been No Sleep Till Sudbury with Brent Jensen. Till next time, folks, take good care.
Brent Jensen is the best-selling author of No Sleep Till Sudbury, Leftover People, and All My Favorite People Are Broken. All titles available in stores and on Amazon worldwide.